I give you the word. You can start. Thank you for this conference, Fullness. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I guess you can all hear me okay. It's quite a small room. Apologies, I'm going to have to speak in English because my Spanish and my Catalan is not very good. But I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much to Josep and Olga for the invitation. We met about 18 months ago doing a competition together, and we had a very nice time at the end playing table football. And yeah, I think it's very nice to see you at home and to be involved. I'm here for a week now at the school. And I actually have lectured. I've never been to Girona before. I have seen Game of Thrones, so I was very pleased to be able to put those two things together. I have been to Barcelona many times because we did a project there, and I've given lectures. You'll be pleased to know that most of what I'm going to show you this evening I've never presented before in Spain. But I am going to show one project, which is an apartment that we designed in Barcelona, which has become one of the most important projects we've ever done in the practice. And a lot of the ideas that we are still working on today were formulated in that project. And the title of the lecture, Fullness, is one of 10 terms that we've used over about the last 5 years to communicate our work publicly to clients and within the office. And actually, that I have presented in Barcelona before, but not in this particular format. And the first thing to say is I don't work alone. It's very much a team effort. So we're now at 18 people, and I think these terms of reference are a lot to do with working in a team and trying to share a kind of common language, a set of ideas. And so we've called them 10 points: collaboration, city, comfort, narrative, craft, fullness. That's today. Background, adaptation, ambiguity, and incompleteness. Many of them, I guess, you would associate with like postmodernism. Certainly the incompleteness and ambiguity and adaptation. And some of them are to do with like contemporary practice more broadly. So collaboration, a recognition that our work is not one of single authorship, but of constant collaboration. And one of the things that I've been talking a lot today with the students about at the architecture faculty is our interest in understanding the contemporary city as a complex, plural, and public entity. But I've chosen to talk about, maybe one could talk about any of these words in relation to the projects I'm going to show. But fullness, that's something I'm trying to share with the students over this week. Pleasure should not be sparing but plentiful. Architecture should feel fulsome. So it's a kind of determination to make architecture rich, and that one's experience should be very substantial, and that this is an ambition. It shouldn't be an occasional encounter with some historic version of architecture, that this could be our experience in the present. So I'm going to show 6 projects. So the top row, the apartment in Barcelona on Carrer Vinyó, And then the most recently completed projects, in the middle, the Victoria and Albert Museum Photography Centre, and on the right, a house in Devon. So the house in Devon has never been published, so you'll be seeing it for the first time. The bottom three projects are, two of them are under construction. So the first is an office building in London. The middle is the competition that we did with Joseph and Olga, which sadly, I shared with them, will never be built because the client just sold the site and made certainly enough money to not bother building it. And I'm happy to say the last building, which is our largest project, is currently under construction. So, right. So first off, the apartment on Calle Vigno. So I guess you'll be familiar with a lot of what I'm going to tell you. So the Gothic Quarter, and I kind of embraced being an architectural tourist in Barcelona, and I think in a way enjoying that is also something to accept that kind of, I know that in Barcelona there's a big debate about how many tourists and where can they stay, but which is also part of the fact that that is a lot of how we understand the world is as tourists these days. And I was interested that to discover that a lot of the Gothic Quarter, of course, isn't Gothic. It's a kind of imagined Gothic district that was built mostly at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. And it was very much part of a Catalan project to create a historical centre. And I think it's that kind of recognition that cities are made in the service of ideas, that cities are political entities, and that this is actually quite a recent project, informed the whole way we then went on to work on this apartment. You know, I think, you know, the kind of the realization that a lot of the things that people enjoy for the idea that they are a millennium old have been produced to create that idea. And I think it's everything in black is what was 19th century. So the site is Placha George Orwell, or Placha Trippy, if you remember. I think it's been slightly tidied up these days. Kind of curious because it's a triangular public space. And you know, as a British architect being invited to work in Barcelona, there was something appealing about the fact that it was already connected to some kind of cultural exchange. But again, this was only named Placha de George Orwell in the 1980s. So again, there's this kind of, I feel it's a kind of repetition of the 19th century project, which is to constantly reaffirm the Catalan identity of the city. And, you know, I couldn't help but see this relationship between the kind of British visitor and our own situation as being part of the story of the project. So there's Placha George Orwell, and this was the apartment. So it's a kind of early 20th century palazzo, and the apartment's on the Piano Nobile, and you can see it's on this very acute angle. What it was like when we first visited. So actually it was owned by two brothers who I'd known since childhood, whose parents had moved from the UK to Barcelona for work, and this they bought this as students, and one of them was going to business school here, and I didn't have my own practice at that time, and I visited and said, well, one day when we've done well, we'll ask you to refurbish it, and they did, and it had some very beautiful fragments, so these faience ceilings, and when they eventually came back to me to talk about this commission, they had in fact become quite successful businessmen, and they no longer lived in Barcelona, but one of them was certainly coming back and forth for business. And they said that this would be somewhere for them to stay when they're visiting the city, a place of pleasure that they could enjoy fully, the idea of Barcelona. And so I started to look at those fragments of the city that most appealed to me as a visitor. And so this is the Gaudi Casa and La Barceloneta by Càrrec. So both buildings as an architecture student that I was fascinated by because of their kind of extraordinary geometry and invention, the use of colour, the material, and I also like this slightly kind of unacceptable possibility of just borrowing from these different architects from different periods without any shame, because I suppose even as a student of architecture, there were things that were incorrect, and of course one eventually wants to absorb everything that's incorrect into one's practice as a way of understanding what actually is important. And for me, this kind of affirmation of pleasure is something very central to my enjoyment of architecture, and that we wanted to share with the client. We were also aware that the client talked about having this grand salon, and we looked at bourgeois houses through the 20th century, the Maison de Verre, and Portalupi's Villa Necchi in Milan, and from each of these projects we borrowed something. And at the time I was surveying Cosmati pavements with my students, so we were travelling to Rome and doing etchings of these really extraordinary patterned floors in churches that were descriptions of the cosmos. And I remembered with the students we were saying, like, it's beautiful, the idea of it's beautiful. We know that audiences in the Middle Ages would look at these floors and understand that they were descriptions of the universe. All of these geometric patterns are related to the geometry of theologians who used mathematics to describe the cosmos. And I think there was a lot of discussion, and it's a discussion that we've already had a little bit in the last day, which was, can one recognize the ambition and the, I suppose that the kind of completeness of this idea that architecture could describe something much larger than one's immediate presence, and what would that? How would one achieve that in any way today, where we live in mostly a godless society? And I'm not particularly religious, but I recognize the contribution of religion to culture, and particularly to architecture. And what was interesting is we surveyed these floors so that we could map the perfect geometry, so the geometry that would have been created by the mathematical plan overlaid with the actual geometry of the church, and that somehow the blur between the two was some measure of this attempt to describe something complete and perfect. Anyway, so all of these things are going on in the office, and we're going back to a small apartment in Barcelona for a couple of now wealthy businessmen. We started to, first we stripped out the dividing walls and we retained the ceilings to create one large space. We then made the floor, which had the same geometry as Placha George Orwell, into a tiled pattern where every tile is the same geometry as Placha George Orwell. And then we inserted a piece of furniture that was made of all of these references from Gaudí, Kodak, Charot, the Villa Necchi by Portaluppi, to create, so this is a miniature version of La Barceloneta. This is the balcony from the Maison de screen from the living room in the Villa Necchi. All on this floor that was trying to capture something about Barcelona, Catalonia, the presence of this British visitor in the story of a city. And then we made one large table so that everyone could sit by the windows and look out at the Gothic Quarter. We asked a local architect that I knew from London, Ángel Martín Cojo, who's a fantastic architect and a very important collaborator, to introduce us to traditional Catalan craftsmen. So this is one of the Martí family from Manresa, and they've been making tiles for Barcelona architects since the 19th century and have made tiles for Gaudí, and so this was perfect. So when the client comes, he knows that there's this connection. So he made every tile on the floor, and we wanted to, though, make it something contemporary. How could we borrow from this kind of historic technology, make something new that was very much about the site? And what we realized was that encaustic tiles are, they were invented in the mid-19th century as a cheaper, because they were easier to make, alternative to terrazzo, but that generally every tile is the same. You have a jig and you just pour in coloured, pigmented concrete. But we realized that if we asked the fabricator to just change the colour every time, it had no impact on the cost, but made a completely different product. So we gave him this matrix and said, please make 75 tiles with 2 colours of green, and then make 78 where you can put 1 cell of pink, and just keep going. And then we explained to his colleagues how to lay them out, so that, like on the roof of the Gaudí Casa, there's now this sweep of colour that changes from red to green as you go round the corner, so accentuating this condition within the city. And yeah, there's a term for this, which is to do with usually colouring hair, where you change the colour from brown to blonde. And if you go on into Wikipedia, under that description for hair is this project, which I'm really proud of. Yeah. So yeah. So, and this is the final arrangements. And so now we're going to show you the as-built project. So you arrive. So the door was original to the house, but now you can see the tiles starting and this brass framed entrance that has this kind of green colour, it's kind of slightly watery reflection. and then you look towards the corner of the apartment. That's the table we designed that fits as a mirror, so you can see around the corner. And then there's this interest in almost like adopting kind of urban strategies for creating an interior. So the wall on the right is grey and the wall on the left is white. So, and then there's this balcony on the right. So it's a bit like that's an elevation and this is a public space. So almost that there's an asymmetry to the interior. And then here's, so the balcony becomes a bookshelf, and there's a stair that can be moved around to give you access to the bedrooms. And here you're looking back at the miniature version of COAC's Barceloneta, which has 2 bedrooms in. And you know, COAC had kind of pioneered these louvers that were to vary the light conditions in La Barceloneta. So we had those incorporated into ours, and so now they're actually 3 layers of acoustic separation between the street and the building. There's triple glazing, and then these louvers, or the building and then the louvers themselves, so that when you're actually in the bedroom, you are really cocooned. And so you have a little staircase. So every room has a bathroom, so you come up and then out this door, there's a bathroom in here. This is a bit like being in the Orient Express. So these like little diminutive spaces. And then this kind of, this possibility of being right in the middle of the Gothic quarter, with all these references to the history of the city and of craft. And these are the colleagues that were involved in it. And Angel was the local architect. Okay, so I'll probably have to get a bit quicker. This is the second project. It's the Victoria and Albert Museum's Photography Centre, which we finished last year. And so this is one of the first museums in the world, built off the proceeds of the Great Exhibition. So the ticket sales were used to build the V&A, and the Photography Centre we won the commission to make a home for what has become one of the largest collections of photographs in the world, following the merger of several previous collections. It's inside an existing gallery, so see it here. And this was the photography collection at the end of the 19th century. And of course, the interesting thing about the relationship of photography to the museum is that they happened at the same time. So one of the lovely things about the photography exhibition, the first one that they put on, is that you see the V&A from its beginnings all the way through to the present day in the medium, because the first photographers were very interested in capturing the first museum kind of thing. This is what it was like when we arrived. So there are these cross walls. It's quite austere. There's not much interest in the existing architecture, and it's only really showing photographs. So we set about to try and understand what are all of the other exhibits that would allow the V&A to tell a much richer story about photography. So the diaries of the photographer, the cameras, objects from their biography, other objects that were in the museum that we could put together in new arrangements, as well as the photographs. And we'd previously worked like this. This is an exhibition we designed for the Design Museum, and these were all brass spigots and carbon fibre rods. And this is a system that could be reconfigured by the Design Museum for every show. And once we'd discussed with the V&A that they would have different types of objects alongside photographs, we then had to make a whole range of different cabinets that could change and be reorganized to suit the show. And this was a photograph that was in the collection of a British expedition to climb Mount Everest. And it kind of made us aware that one of the interesting things about the history of photography is that it has its own spatial history, its own architecture. So the very first photographs had to be processed immediately adjacent to the camera because the chemistry was so volatile. So you had to travel, it's a bit like going on a hunting expedition. You'd have to have a cart with a tent on it called a dark tent. You'd have to have all the chemistry in the back, and as soon as you've exposed the plate, you'd have to kind of run in, close the thing, and there'd be like kind of, fumes. So perhaps, a lot more kind of involving than using one of these. And we started to see this kind of history of photography as being also a history of adventure, of this kind of new art form, and of these new spaces. And we were also interested in the connection of this kind of tent space to the history of architecture more broadly. So this is the frontispiece of Logier's thesis on architecture, that the primitive hut is in fact something solid, primarily to do with structure. And this can be compared to theories of architecture that, this is Schinkel's Charlottenhof Palace Interior, Charlottenburg, and this idea that the origins of architecture are like Bedouin tents. It's only the surface that matters, and the structure is only there to support the surface. And that the art form of photography was quite instrumental in forcing the view that the surface is the most important aspect of reality. And somehow this idea that what photography had done to other art forms, one can see in this kind of relationship between different kinds of architecture. And the galleries that we worked in had recently been transformed into a domestic interior for an exhibition. So again, there's this kind of idea that maybe the gallery was also like someone's bedroom. So this is the proposal, that we would insert these cases that were all different sizes and shapes, so that they could include all of the different types of object related to the biographies of photographers that would be able to move around. That all of the color schemes would be like the interiors of like large houses rather than like a museum, and that there would be a dark tent that would offer a new kind of space for showing completely blacked out like video and projection inserted as a little piece of architecture inside the museum, a kind of fabric, kind of permanent fabric architecture inside this massive structure. And here you can see we also did the hang of the first collection in the different cases, and as this arrival point, these 2 rooms of new wall hangs and new objects, and then the dark tents. And so this again is a kind of walkthrough now of the scheme as built. So here you can handle historic cameras and see the different optics and look through this window to the gardens. And then this is a collection. So some of these cameras, if a museum in the world had one of them, it would be considered, a really rare object. And the V&A's collection, they have just extraordinary numbers of these original cameras. And here you can see these cases that now, rather than just having photographs, have all of the objects related to the photographers. We've removed the cross walls. All the colours are chosen to feel like historic houses, and the colours also pick out the lunettes, which were original, that were previously hidden by the cross walls. And here we designed the furniture that allow you to sit diagonally, not perpendicular. So again, trying to encourage this view that now you look across the room and make connections between different periods and different objects. For example. And we made these very large cases that were kind of architectural, that also then framed other parts of the museum, and new interactive exhibits. So these are viewers for looking at stereoscopic images. And then lastly, this is inside the dark tent. So this feeling of kind of like fabric surface, and that this was the kind of architectural equivalent to the medium. And there you can see pictures of that original expedition. And here's the walls can be opened up to make it part of the larger room, or closed for smaller presentations. And you can see that the kind of, even though this is a kind of autonomous object, it's playing a lot with the geometry of the kind of more permanent architecture. And that's the team. Okay, so this is the most recently completed project. It's a house in Devon, and it's one of about 4 houses that we are currently working on. Half of it is existing. It's an ice cream factory, so it was the first ever. It's using organic farming techniques to make organic ice cream, and this was the first in the UK. And the farmers that own it now want to retire, and they want to turn it into like a series of homes that they will live in. And so they're going to live here, and we haven't finished that one yet, but this one they got planning permission for, to extend it by this piece, and it was bought by a couple of furniture designers that we then worked with to complete the project. So that's the new house, and this is this collection of buildings. That's the farm in a valley near the sea. And this is the family, the Redstone family. So what's extraordinary is that they're called Redstone. The stone in this valley is red, and the name of the valley is Rokum, which means redstone. So, but you know, she's American, he's from the north of England, so quite how this all happened, I don't know. But the little boy is Elias Redstone, who's an architecture critic. And so he introduced us to his parents, and then we've been working with them for about 7 years on these different houses. And all of the buildings have this kind of rubble red stone, and also red brick detailing. So again, we're very interested in choosing all the details from the surrounding and trying to make this kind of composite architecture that's like as pleasurable as possible. There are also these typical agricultural sheds, and this is a Joseph Frank drawing of, it's from a series that he did of houses for his lover. I think he drew about 20, 30 houses and sent them to her. And what I loved is this kind of strange hybridity of different architectures that are put together with no, again, Joseph Frank, for someone alive during the height of modernism, was incredibly relaxed about what was correct or not. And I still feel that this is very somehow current. So this is the existing house, which is a cob barn, and we added a courtyard, a new extension, and a garage. And above the new extension, there's a stair, this is a void, and a couple of bedrooms. So here you can see the ice cream factory. There's the courtyard and the new extension, and the seas over there. And the house is this very strange kind of, it's really at the bottom of a very, very big hill. So one of the issues is a lot of water that comes down here. And so a lot of money went into making sure the water didn't go into the house, because we then buried the house, which is probably the most, from an engineering point of view, the worst thing you could do. But it meant that the section from here is that you really go down into this enormous thing, and when you're in the kitchen, you're looking up at this hill, and that became almost like the ordering device for the interiors, that each of the spaces would lead to this moment where you would just appreciate this huge view. So you arrive in this courtyard, you step down into the living room, you step down again to the kitchen, and then your kitchen counter is at the level of the ground. And the space is, like Carré Vigneault, it's trying to be very theatrical. It's trying to give lots of opportunities to engage with the people you're living with visitors. So there's a lot of views through and across. I mean, also like the V&A in a way. And these are early sketches about, so here you're in the living room, you can see into the kitchen, you can see the hillside, you can see the balcony. So it's quite theatrical. And again, you can see into the courtyard, all the different parts of the house come together around this fireplace. This is a very important precedent for me. It's Florian Bagel's Half Moon Theatre in London, and again that has similarities to Carré Vigneault, this feeling like it's inside, but the walls have the appearance of being facades to buildings, and that this feels like a public space, and this ambiguity about that being a window or an opening, and that this gives an interior all of the kind of rules of a public space, which obviously for a theatre is completely, makes it feel like even more a place for performing the social life of the city. And these are early models of the interior of this house, the ice cream factory. And here's the final thing. So you're in the living room, you can see the hillside beginning there, these different views into different bedrooms, and these are the kind of the experience of it as this kind of kaleidoscope of different fragments of the surroundings. And I think the other thing is this feeling, so you arrive here, go into this yard, and then into the house. So this is the arrival. This is the door to the courtyard. You can see the chimney stack. There's a little passage. This red stone that was from the area. And then here you've now arrived, and this is the courtyard, and there's a tree that will grow up here, and then you can see the landscape over the edge. There's a seat on the south side so that you can take off your boots in the sun and go into the door. So that's that seat. And then here again, seats, row of cupboards. You step down into the living room. That's that central fireplace, the kind of connection to the courtyard, and down into the kitchen, a view into a bedroom. And again, each of the, like the furniture makes smaller rooms. So you insert this library and the staircase and the window. I mean, and they're furniture makers, so they've gone and made each of these pieces. That's the client, Russell Pinch and Una. So here you can see this level distance where you're like in the hillside. And there's this kind of brick detail that's from the surrounding architecture. And it's very composite, so you know, each of the openings has a different idea. But there's something like a face to it. So I'm always interested in architecture both being figurative and abstract, so that a lot of our projects, you look at them a bit differently, they look like bits of bodies, or you get the most amazing view in the bath, which is here. So again, it feels like it's looking up the hill. Okay. So 2 projects left. We're kind of getting there. So the next 2 projects are much larger, and I think what I've been very interested in is, you know, in our practice, what is the continuity between the early ideas and the larger scale? Is it possible when you're working on an interior like Cade Vigno to actually have that richness and density in a much bigger building? And that feels like a kind of, we're trying to test that now. Oh, actually 3 left, God. Right, so first off, so this is on site. We're building 2 buildings here. This is part of 16 buildings, and Borozzi Vega, who you know, are, I think this is one of theirs, and this one. And our building is at the end of a very long bus depot. So again, we said to the client that our building ought to respond to the scale and position within the city. This is this huge Calatrava building, which shows you the scale. These are, I think we specialise in little things, even when they're bigger, because this is huge. They actually just cancelled this project. But anyway, so we said that there would be the name of the building, and it would have this big entrance, so that it would be very welcoming, and that the facade would be kind of ambiguous as to its scale. So this is Jim Sterling's conversion of the warehouses in Liverpool into the Tate, and the Maison de Verre, which again I referred to in Cade Vigno, but I've always loved, because if you look at the building, you can't tell, is it big, is it small, is it when you don't see this particular view shows you the windows of the surrounding buildings, and you realize it's tiny. But when you see it photographed, when it's backlit and everything else is invisible, you think it's this really grand space. So we're very interested in how can one achieve that ambiguity of scale. And then we're also very interested in, because these 16 buildings are for craft businesses, so they have rent capped, they cost below £30 a square metre, which is in London considered affordable, and they're for creative industries. And we looked at the history of districts for creative industries, of which, you know, the guilds are the kind of first examples, and this is one of the Scuola Grande in Venice, and this idea that these buildings were highly decorated and they were very explicit about their patron saints, what their crafts were, and that this could be something that we would bring into a contemporary architecture via Venturi, Scott Brown, and learning from Las Vegas. So this idea that you're creating a building to be seen from the bus depot, how could you aim for a highly iconographic contemporary architecture that reflects a kind of car culture. So this is our building, and this is the second one. And this is Sal Gascano as well, and that's Palazzo Vega. So these are the two buildings where they're kind of, you know, come on in, can't tell how big it is, and a big sign to tell you where you are. And then on the corners, there are figurative sculptures. So again, a bit like the patron saints of the scuole, these give a kind of very civic character to the buildings. So almost elevating what generally offices are considered kind of like background neutral commercial space. All of these inflections are celebrating the role of the kind of craft industries as civic institutions. So it's again, it's trying to kind of subtly shift the status of what you're looking at, which I guess is a kind of political decision. And this is an artist that we're working with on the sculpture, Toby Ziegler. And then on the backs of the buildings, they each have niches that can be opened from the inside, and we have a program with the developer that every year all of the sculpture is changed so that there's this kind of constant kind of shop window for the crafts in the district. And so here you can see the back of our building. This is by 6A, and that's Sal Gascano, and that's the cancelled Calatrava project. And this is what it looks like now. We're just building it. It's actually a bit more developed now. So this is the penultimate one, and this is from the competition that we did together. And Architect did a very beautiful scheme as well, which I wish you could show it as well. But so it's for a site in the center of Berlin. There are these 5 Eber villas, so kind of postmodern 1980s buildings on the Landwehr Canal, and here's the Tiergarten. The kind of Potsdamer Platz is kind of over here, and to the south is a 19th century pump house. And again, we were interested in an understanding of the surrounding city. So kind of Berlin's grain is kind of fascinating because often the perimeter is quite grand bourgeois houses or apartment buildings, and then all the guts of the city, like the factories and the kind of dirty uses, are hidden in the middle. So, you know, you would come through the genteel surface and encounter kind of workshops, and we were very interested in that this site was a kind of paradigm of this typical courtyard arrangement. And so these are these 5 Eber villas. Now I think this might be a film. I'm not sure. I wouldn't know how to play it, but let's see. Oh dear. What have I started? Do I push this? No. What does that say? Oh. Anyway, I suppose what the film shows is as you walk along the canal, you see this chimney of the factory, or the pump house, in the middle of the site appear and disappear. So it kind of, the site reveals this layering in a very explicit way that's unusual, because normally you don't build these villas with gaps. That was a very kind of 1980s kind of urban scheme. And we were interested in, again, a kind of fine reading of the context. So these 1980s buildings are now considered quite kind of have some heritage value, and postmodernism is now becoming part of acceptable history, even in Berlin. And this is the building on the other side, this kind of really exquisite red brick pump house. And our site is kind of in the gap between these two. And so we proposed that our building would look both ways and be made of this kind of relationship. So that's Janus, the kind of the Roman god of beginnings and ends and doorways. And so we looked at even at the detail of the winter gardens that were on these 1980s buildings, and the steel framed windows on the 19th century pump house. We had to maximize the plan, which I think we both tried very hard to do. So that gave this particular form. And then we tried to give it a singular appearance, and then we had to do all the things that efficient buildings need to do to make the car parks in the basement work with the bedrooms, and that gave us a grid. But we also, the site's kind of particular because it's a cul-de-sac, it's a dead end. You can only arrive here and walk to the end. So we needed it to somehow create an elevation, if you like, that faced this point. So we then serrated the facade so that every apartment had rooms that looked to the entrance. And again, there was this interest then in looking at diagonal plan arrangements like Codex Barceloneta, where you have this kind of very dynamic quality of arrival and the apartments opening out. So here, all of the bedrooms are to the north, and then the apartments open to be kind of wider to the south, and then there are these staircases and lifts. So the lifts open directly into each apartment to minimize the lobby spaces. And so here you can begin to see the relationship of the new building to these two architectures. And the kind of presence of this chimney drove the strategy of creating these kind of chimneys through the building. So as a kind of organizing principle, you would always enter into a chimney that would have the same materiality as the pump house, and that would deliver you directly into your apartment. And then there were fireplaces on the upper stories that were also somehow making these kind of rooms that open to the south feel like maybe flexible, slightly outdoorsy. You can go camping in these rooms. And here's the so this kind of facade that looks to the entrance, and then a major public room there. And then this is one of the apartments on the top, and then you can go up a staircase onto the roof. And so that's the 19th century chimney, and then every staircase finishes, or lifts and staircases finish in this kind of roofscape of kind of quite playful terracotta structures that link to, I mean, in England there are these extraordinary, they're called prodigy houses. They were all built in the hope of attracting Queen Elizabeth to be a bride. Literally, they would build the house for when the Queen came, and they got more and more elaborate. And so this one, the whole roofscape is like a garden made of dining terraces and pyramids, and so we were very interested in this. Again, I think in many of our projects we take architectures that were once high expressions of a kind of bourgeois or quite a kind of stratified society, and offer them in much more democratic circumstances. So this feeling like you don't have to strip away the pleasures that were enjoyed by others in history. They can still be appropriated for a more kind of a kind of accessible contemporary city life. Now this, I think, is another film. I guess it's not going to work, but here basically you can see this walk along the, I don't know, does this do? No, it doesn't matter. Anyway, as you walk along, you can see the building popping up. Okay, last project. I'm doing 24. So this is a project for a quad in Oxford for one of the colleges. So all of these yellow rectangles are one of the 32 colleges in the city. Our client is New College, which is from the 14th century, and it's famous for having the first ever quad. So that's the first time that a chapel was connected to a house, was connected to student accommodation, a dining hall, all in one building. And it's on the site of the city wall of Oxford, and this was front quad, and then was added to later cloister quad, and then a kind of radical new type of building in the 17th century, garden quad, so three-sided, looking out at a garden. And here you can see great quad, garden quad, and then finally in the 19th century, the last time that they built a quad until now, this is Holywell quad. So that's great quad, garden quad, cloister, Holywell, and this is our site, and this is our new building, which is creating 3 south-facing quads that also incorporates existing buildings and a new tower. So there's New College, and that's the site. So you can see the kind of, the city begins to become quite suburban here. So we were interested in reflecting that in the architecture. So in 1403, the first quad was very much a kind of defensive structure to separate the institution from the city. There was literally like lots of young men turning up in a kind of market town. You know, all the locals were like, you know, we don't like it. There was violence. There was a lot of deaths of, you know, local people in fights with students, you know. So they created these, they're kind of like cloistered buildings to separate the students from the city. That's why in 1685, to make it three-sided and open to a garden is really quite radical. It shows the transformation over, you know, 250 years of an institution from being like almost segregated inside the city to being open to the city. And at the time, in 1685, they started to invite townsfolk to actually take up residence in the college for the first time. So we were interested, you know, another 250 years later, what form would imply this kind of continuation of a more progressive, open attitude towards others and the outside. And it was that there wouldn't be this screen, that the garden would extend into the quad, and that the form of the architecture and the garden would be made equivalent. So the value given to the outside and the inside is formally the same. And we were quite influenced by Stirling's Flory building, which was very radical in its attitude to making a quad. So this horseshoe next to the canal. So this was the site as we found it. There was lots of 19th century villas with gardens that if you aggregated all the gardens. It made a really large site, and they put a new building in that created these collegiate south-facing spaces. So this is the final plan. So there's an entrance building with a gate house, a tower. This is a new structure of student rooms. You arrive, so east quad, west quad, and this is a quad this is a school, new college school. And the new building is effectively stitching all of the exterior spaces together. And we were very interested in, again, making sense of the surrounding architecture. So these are the roofscapes. So you have neo-Gothic, and this is arts and crafts. And this is a kind of combination of the two. And this is the kind of contemporary architecture that surrounds it. So again, my point that this is kind of like flat, these are kind of like the kind of heartbeats of the different architecture. This is kind of like flatlined. And there's some nod to Gaudí. So Gaudí's work is contemporary with this. And so I think it remains kind of radical in a way. So this is the arts and crafts building. This is a kind of neo-Gothic, and this is a kind of hybrid. And here you can see our building is kind of trying to billow out to match the existing in some way. Then it becomes quite articulated. And in the plan, so these are bedrooms, and there's this corridor that curves round, and there's larger rooms, public function rooms. And again, this is a nod to Stirling's Flory building, which has these duplexes to make use of the roof space. I won't go too much into this, but this is a text that we lent on very heavily about making new buildings in historic settings, and that you could use the theories of landscape design that were popularized in kind of picturesque 18th century landscapes to make architecture. So in that book, Pevsner described a walk. So here's New College. He described this walk around New College, and that think of this like looking at a landscape where new buildings are introduced to frame and make beautiful the relationship between the parts. So this idea, this is all contrived over centuries, that the new bits make the old bits kind of fit in. So that's a Hawksmoor Tower. You know, these kind of archways framing views, these kind of meandering spaces, and the Bridge of Sighs, borrowed from Venice, which I feel has something to do with the Gothic Quarter in some funny way. This kind of deliberate appropriation of exotic architectures, and then you finally arrive in, you know, the kind of central set-piece buildings in Oxford that everyone knows under the Bridge of Sighs. So this is our scheme now. So you arrive here, the entrance gateway, the new tower, the quad, and these three courtyards. And the tower signals this new geometry across the city. Again, this is a film which shows it turning, so that the idea is it looks different from every angle. That's stuck. Okay. And so here you can see our tower, and there's the Hawksmoor Tower. So proving that it's tall but not so tall that they wouldn't give it permission. I think there's more films. Right. So this is the last series of slides which kind of explain in this kind of idea of a kind of picturesque unfolding of a landscape where you insert things in order to accentuate the relationships between all the parts. So here's the the entrance gateway that frames fragments of new. This is the old listed building, this is the new building. So we deliberately allowed the longest view across the site to be framed by this entrance. This is North Quad, so this building was much longer. We've chopped it back to create a view through to the next college, and then you can see the Civil War ramparts, which is from the Charles I defence of the city. The new building, and so again trying to tie into these roofscapes but in a kind of contemporary way. This is looking back at the tower. There's actually a tree here, but again it's very expressive architecture. This is the main set piece of West Quad, so where you're completely enveloped by this new architecture. And I think that's the end of the story. So I hope this idea of fullness, that one could quite liberally explore historic architectures, social moments within the city, and quite deliberately try and make a contemporary architecture that has a kind of heightened level of pleasure, and that maybe this is trying to act as a kind of antidote to architectures that feel that they have to be too correct in their kind of stating of a kind of newness separate from history or the city. Oh, that's all the people that really should get the credit. So thank you very much. Yeah.